As the spring of 1945 dawned across Europe, the Third Reich was collapsing. What had begun as strategic withdrawals along the Western Front had devolved into a chaotic retreat as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany itself. The once vaunted Wehrmacht, stretched beyond its limits and critically short of fuel, ammunition and hope, faced the grim reality that had been inevitable for months. In the rolling farmlands of Thuringia, the remnants of the 212th Infantry Division trudged eastward under the command of Oberst Werner Hoffmann. Once 15,000 strong, the unit now numbered barely 4,000 men, a collection of veterans, teenagers, and older reservists who had survived the brutal winter fighting in the Ardennes, only to find themselves caught in the vice between Patton's Third Army to the west and the rapidly advancing Soviet forces from the east. The morning air carried the distant rumble of artillery as Hoffmann studied his maps by flashlight in the pre-dawn darkness of an abandoned schoolhouse. His intelligence officer, a gaunt captain who had lost an eye at Caen, pointed to the latest positions. "Soviet forward units crossed the Elbe yesterday, Herr Oberst. Their advance elements are moving faster than predicted, 40 kilometers east, perhaps less." Hoffmann nodded silently. To the west, American armored columns had bypassed their position the previous day, cutting the main roads to Frankfurt. The radio crackled intermittently with fragmented orders from Corps headquarters, most contradictory, some incoherent. "And our supply situation?" Hoffmann asked, though he already knew the answer. "Ammunition for perhaps one day of moderate combat, fuel for half the vehicles, medical supplies critically short." What Hoffmann didn't need to hear was the other reality, that behind his battered division, elements of the 3rd SS Panzer Division were establishing blocking positions, enforcing Hitler's no-retreat orders with summary executions. The previous evening, 2 of his company commanders had been shot for suggesting a tactical withdrawal. In that moment, Hoffmann made the decision that would save thousands of lives. Looking at his assembled staff officers, their faces haggard from years of war, he spoke clearly. "We will surrender to the Americans." The room fell silent. To surrender meant being branded as traitors by the Nazi hierarchy. For their families back home, potential reprisals. But to continue east meant certain destruction between the American hammer and the Soviet anvil. Prepare white flags. Send a reconnaissance team under a flag of truce toward the American lines. No weapons, full dress uniform. Lieutenant Bauer speaks English. He will lead them. Hey there, viewers. The decisions made in these final desperate days of World War II shaped the fate of thousands of soldiers and civilians alike. If you're enjoying this historical journey, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our upcoming episodes on crucial turning points of the war. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing how these stories connect with people around the world. Now, back to that spring morning in 1945. Lieutenant Karl Bauer and 3 soldiers departed at first light in a staff car stripped of weapons, a white bedsheet tied to a broomstick protruding from the passenger window. They followed rural roads westward, navigating around disabled German vehicles and past small groups of disoriented Wehrmacht soldiers who stared in disbelief at the white flag. 10 kilometers west, they encountered the 1st American Patrol, a Sherman tank and 2 jeeps from the 4th Armored Division's Reconnaissance Battalion. Nervous young Americans with Thompson submachine guns, trained on the approaching Germans, ordered them to halt with shouted English commands. "We seek to surrender our division," Bauer called out in accented English, his hands raised. 4,000 men. We request safe passage through your lines." The American lieutenant, a stocky Nebraskan named Roberts, radioed his headquarters while keeping the Germans under guard. An hour later, a jeep arrived carrying Major William Harwick of G2 Intelligence and a translator, though Bauer's English proved adequate. "Your entire division wants to surrender?" Harwick asked skeptically. "Yes, sir," Bauer replied. We are caught between your forces and the Russians. Behind us, SS units are shooting those who retreat. Oberst Hoffmann wishes to surrender his men to American forces and requests safe transit to your lines." Harwick studied the German officer. The war was effectively over, with Berlin surrounded and Hitler reportedly holed up in his bunker. But the surrender of an entire division required careful handling, especially with thousands of armed men involved. "Why not just lay down your weapons and wait for our forces to reach you?" Bauer's expression darkened. "The SS, Major. They have established positions behind us. They are shooting deserters. And—" He hesitated. "Many of our soldiers have family in areas the Russians have taken. The stories that have reached us." He left the implication hanging. The American officers conferred privately. The U.S. Army had encountered this situation increasingly. German units fighting desperately to reach American or British lines rather than face Soviet captivity. The strategic implications were significant, but the humanitarian considerations equally compelling. After radio consultations with division headquarters, Harwick returned. "We can accept your surrender, but under strict conditions. Your men will stack all heavy weapons before movement. They will march in formation under white flags. Our tanks will escort the column to prevent any misunderstandings." Bauer nodded. "There is one more matter, Major. The SS units behind us, when they discover our intentions." Harwick understood immediately. The retreating column would be vulnerable from the rear, caught between their American captors and vengeful SS forces who viewed surrender as treason. "We'll provide security front and rear," Harwick said after a moment's thought. "A tank platoon will take up positions at your current rear echelon, but we need to move quickly. I'll send these men back with you to arrange the details. The column needs to be moving by 1600 hours. As Lieutenant Bauer returned to the division's makeshift headquarters, the enormity of what they were about to attempt settled over him. 4,000 men would soon be marching into captivity, but first they had to survive the wrath of their own countrymen. The cold dawn of April 1945 revealed the strange procession forming along a rural road in eastern Germany. A battered column of German military vehicles, requisitioned farm trucks, a few half-tracks with faded Balkenkreuz markings, horse-drawn wagons, and hundreds of foot soldiers assembled in the pre-morning haze. They had surrendered the previous evening to elements of the U.S. Armored Division, pushing eastward through crumbling German defenses. Staff Sergeant Robert Harlow of Baker Company watched from the turret of his M4A3 Sherman tank as German officers organized their men. His platoon of 5 tanks had been assigned an unusual mission: escort this surrendered Wehrmacht column safely through territory where remnants of SS units were hunting down traitors attempting to surrender. "I never thought we'd be protecting Germans," muttered Corporal Wilson, Harlow's gunner. 2 weeks ago, we were killing each other." The Sherman's radio crackled with the voice of Lieutenant Foster, the platoon commander. "Baker 2, this is Baker 6. Keep your boys alert. Intelligence reports Kampfgruppe Müller operating 10 miles southeast. They've been executing surrendered units. Out." Harlow acknowledged and surveyed the column. Nearly 700 German soldiers, mostly Wehrmacht infantry, a few Luftwaffe ground personnel, and even some Volkssturm militia in civilian clothes with armbands, stood in loose formation. Their weapons had been collected and loaded onto a requisitioned lumber truck. The German commander, a Major Kraus, approached Harlow's tank with a young lieutenant who spoke limited English. "The men are ready," the lieutenant translated, "but we fear SS patrols. They will shoot us from behind." Harlow nodded. "Tell him we'll have tanks at the front, middle and rear. 2 of our tanks will scout the flanks." The arrangement was unprecedented, American armor protecting surrendered enemy forces, but these were unprecedented times as the Third Reich collapsed. At 0630 hours, the column lurched into motion. Harlow's Sherman took point, while Lieutenant Foster's tank brought up the rear. Between them stretched nearly a mile of defeated German soldiers walking westward. The column had to cover 28 miles to reach the American main line, a journey that would take all day at their current pace. By mid-morning, the strange procession passed through a small farming village. The few remaining civilians, mostly old men and women, stared in disbelief at German soldiers being escorted by American tanks. One elderly woman spat at the passing troops. A German sergeant simply lowered his eyes and kept walking. Near a crossroads at 1100 hours, the column halted abruptly when the radio in Harlow's tank erupted. "Baker 1, this is Baker 5. Movement in the tree line, half-mile south. Vehicle engines." Tension rippled through both American tankers and German prisoners. Major Krauss quickly ordered his men into defensive positions along drainage ditches. The irony wasn't lost on either side. Germans and Americans preparing to jointly defend against other Germans. Lieutenant Foster's voice came through the static. "All Baker units, hold position. Baker 3 and Baker 4, investigate southern approach, weapons tight." 2 Shermans peeled away toward the tree line. 15 tense minutes passed. Finally, the radio crackled again. "Baker 6, this is Baker 3. 3 German trucks appears to be displaced civilians. No military threat, continuing route reconnaissance." The column resumed its westward trek, but the incident had changed something. German officers began positioning their strongest men at the column's flanks, forming a protective barrier around their more vulnerable comrades without being asked. At a narrow bridge spanning a small river around 1400 hours, the column faced its most dangerous moment. The bridge needed to be crossed in single file, creating a bottleneck that would leave them exposed. As Harlow's tank rolled onto the wooden structure, a shot echoed from distant woods. "Contact right!" shouted Corporal Wilson, swinging the Sherman's turret toward the threat. A second shot rang out, then a sustained burst of machine gun fire. The rear elements of the German column scattered for cover. Lieutenant Foster's tank at the rear returned fire, its 75mm main gun sending a high explosive round into the tree line. Baker 6 to all units. Small enemy force, possibly SS patrol. 8 to 10 personnel. They're targeting the German column, not us. What followed was surreal. American tanks providing covering fire, while surrendered German soldiers crossed the bridge in small groups, running westward under the protection of their former enemies. 3 Germans fell to sniper fire before the rest made it across. When the firing stopped, the American tankers discovered the German major organizing a recovery team to retrieve their dead. "They were our comrades," he explained simply through his translator. By late afternoon, fatigue set in. Many German soldiers had been marching for days before surrendering. Some collapsed along the roadside. American tankers shared water and K-rations with the men who just days before had been their mortal enemies. At a rest halt, a middle-aged German medic approached Harlow's tank. In broken English, he explained, "My brother prisoner in America, New Jersey. I hope Americans there like you." He offered Harlow a worn pocket watch as thanks. Harlow declined but shared his cigarettes instead. Radio reports warned of more SS activity ahead as the column neared the outskirts of a medium-sized town that American forces had captured 2 days earlier. Lieutenant Foster called his tank commanders together while the Germans rested. "Intelligence says elements of the 12th SS might be reorganizing in this area. They're targeting deserters specifically. We need to push through without stopping." He pointed to the map. "There's an alternate route through these farm tracks. It's longer, but provides more cover." As dusk approached, the column diverted onto the narrow country lanes. Progress slowed on the rutted farm tracks. German soldiers helped push vehicles that became stuck in the soft spring mud. The sound of distant artillery, American batteries firing eastward, grew louder. They were getting closer to the main American lines. A sudden burst of automatic weapons fire erupted from a farmhouse ahead. 2 German soldiers at the front of the column fell. Harlow's Sherman immediately swung its turret and fired around into the building's 2nd floor. American infantry, who had been sent to reinforce the escort, emerged from concealed positions along the roadside and moved to secure the farmhouse. 2 SS men, reported the infantry lieutenant minutes later. Looks like they were waiting specifically to ambush surrendering troops. The column halted while medics, both American and German, treated the wounded. As night fell, the strange procession continued westward, illuminated only by shielded flashlights and the occasional flare overhead. The Americans were now just as determined as the Germans to complete this unusual mission. Around 2200 hours, the welcome challenge came through Harlow's radio. Unknown column approaching from the east, identify yourself. Baker 2, escorting surrendered Wehrmacht personnel as ordered. Who? Harlow responded, requesting passage through the line. Ahead in the darkness, powerful searchlights suddenly illuminated the road. The American main defensive line was just half a mile ahead. After nearly 16 hours, their dangerous journey was almost complete. Lieutenant Foster drove forward to coordinate the final approach. The column would need to be processed through a designated surrender point, where the Germans would formally enter captivity and the American tank escort could finally stand down. As Harlow watched the exhausted German soldiers straightening their ranks for the final march into American territory, he reflected on the strange day. These men had gambled their lives on the Americans' humanity, choosing surrender to the Western Allies over both continued fighting and the uncertain fate that awaited them with the advancing Soviets from the east. A young German soldier approached Harlow's tank. He couldn't have been more than 17. In halting English, he asked, "America, good country." In the cold, grey light of dawn, the unusual procession approached the American lines near Torgau. First came the Sherman tanks, their engines rumbling steadily, followed by the mixed column of German military vehicles and hundreds of walking Wehrmacht soldiers. Radio operator Clarence Smoyer, in the lead American tank, made contact with the forward command post. "Foxhound 6, this is Pershing 3. We are inbound with the German column. Request clearance for approach. Over." The reply came quickly. "Pershing 3, maintain current heading. We have you on observation. Follow flare signals for routing to processing area. Out." As they crested the final ridge, the full extent of the American position became visible. Machine gun nests and artillery pieces were trained on the approaching column, a necessary precaution despite the prearranged surrender. Green flares arced into the sky, marking the designated approach route that would keep the surrendering forces away from sensitive areas. Lieutenant Harold Wilson, commander of the escort platoon, turned to Colonel Werner Braun, the senior German officer. "This is where we part ways, Colonel. Follow that marked path. Your men will be directed to assembly areas. Keep them in formation and orderly." Braun nodded, his face showing the complex emotions of the moment. "Lieutenant, I wish to express my gratitude. Without your escort, I doubt many of us would have survived the journey." The processing of over 800 surrendered German troops was a logistical operation the Americans had become increasingly efficient at handling as the war neared its end. The column was directed to a former farm field where temporary fencing created holding areas. Engineers had established collection points for weapons, military equipment, and personal effects. Staff Sergeant Raymond Gaines oversaw the initial processing. "Form into groups of 50, officers to my right, all weapons placed in the collection trucks. Keep all identification papers on your person." The Germans, many showing visible relief at having reached safety, complied with the instructions without resistance. For most, the fear that had gripped them during the journey, that SS units would attack them as traitors, began to fade only now behind American lines. Private First Class Thomas Meyer, a German-speaking American from Wisconsin, served as one of the translators. "Many of them keep asking if they'll be sent east," he reported to his commanding officer. "They're terrified of Soviet captivity." Captain James Hendricks nodded. "Standard procedure. They'll be moved to temporary camps west of the Rhine, then likely to the States or other Allied territories. Make sure they understand that." The medical processing revealed the condition of the German troops. Many showed signs of malnutrition and exhaustion, the result of months of deteriorating supply lines. Army doctors established a triage area where the most seriously ill or wounded received immediate attention. "These men haven't had proper rations in weeks," noted Captain Richard Stevens, a medical officer examining the German soldiers. "I'm seeing early scurvy, untreated minor wounds, respiratory infections. Nothing surprising given the collapse of their logistics, but we'll need to allocate additional medical supplies." As the day progressed, the methodical American military machine transformed a ragged, surrendered enemy force into categorized, documented prisoners of war. Typists created individual record cards, photographers took identification photos, and military intelligence officers conducted preliminary screenings. For 19-year-old Wehrmacht Private Hans Müller, the process brought an overwhelming sense of finality. "I have been fighting since I was 17, he told the processing officer through a translator. "Now, I don't know what happens next." Similar scenes played out across Germany in those final weeks of April 1945. The strategic decision to surrender to American or British forces rather than await the advancing Soviets had become common among German units. This particular column was one of dozens making similar calculations and journeys. In the officers' debriefing tent, Colonel Braun provided American intelligence officers with details of German positions and strengths further east. "The Ninth Army is completely shattered," he explained, pointing to a map. "These units here are without fuel, these without ammunition. Many commanders are making independent decisions now." Lieutenant Wilson's tank platoon, their escort duty complete, underwent debriefing with their battalion commander. "The toughest moment was when we heard reports of SS units paralleling our route," Wilson recounted. "We had to decide whether to take defensive positions or continue moving. Stopping might have made us a better target, but movement made us more visible." For the American soldiers who had been fighting the German army for months or years, the experience of protecting enemy troops presented a strange moral adjustment. Private James Donovan, a gunner in one of the Sherman tanks, later wrote in a letter home, "Yesterday I was trying to kill these same men. Today I was ready to die protecting them. War makes for strange situations." The fate of the surrendered column diverged according to rank and specialization. Officers were separated for more intensive interrogation. Specialists like communications experts, engineers, and intelligence personnel were identified for detailed technical debriefing. The majority, regular infantry and support troops, were processed for transport to larger POW facilities in France and eventually the United States. By evening, the field had transformed into an organized temporary camp. Army cooks had established field kitchens, serving the first proper meals many of the German soldiers had seen in weeks. The surrender operation, beginning with the initial contact 3 days earlier, was deemed a complete success in the unit's after-action report. For these German soldiers, surrender to American forces likely saved their lives twice over. First, from the combat of a hopeless last stand, and second, from the uncertain fate of Soviet captivity. Records would later show that less than 40% of German POWs taken by Soviet forces survived to return home, while over 99% of those in American custody lived through their captivity. In the years after the war, This escort operation became part of the complex tapestry of stories that defined the war's end, a moment when humanity briefly transcended the brutal logic of combat. In 1965, at a veterans gathering in Chicago, Lieutenant Wilson, by then a school principal in Pennsylvania, reunited with Colonel Braun, who had rebuilt his life as an engineer in Hamburg. Their handshake across a banquet table symbolized the reconciliation that gradually replaced the enmity of war. The protection of surrendered enemy forces, though far from unique in the closing days of the European theater, represented the beginning of the transition from the ethics of combat to those of peace. For the men involved, both Americans and Germans, it remained a powerful memory of how, even in war's darkest hours, choices could still be made that honored the fundamental value of human life.